Let's talk about intelligence. This is a complicated term. The word comes from the Latin verb, which means to comprehend or to perceive. And in the Middle Ages, it was a scholarly technical term for understanding. Well, book learning or scholarly academic ability is one way to think of intelligence, but there are many other ways to think of it. So intelligence often is thought of as more the capacity to learn and understand and solve problems. People, of course, differ from one another in their ability to understand complex ideas, to adapt to their environment, to learn from experience, and so on. So psychologists are very interested in studying intelligence, measuring intelligence, and coming up with different ideas about intelligence that we will cover in this video. The first thing to understand about intelligence is that it's not a physical thing. You can't get a jar of intelligence and study it. It is what scientists call a hypothetical construct. That is, it's an abstract concept. If you have 100 people and you ask them what intelligence is, you'll probably get 100 different answers. And in the sciences, when we have a hypothetical construct, in order to study it, we have to make it measurable. So we need a definition that allows us to measure intelligence. This is called an operational definition. There are many different operational definitions of intelligence, but let's start with one of the most common and one of the most controversial, and that is the IQ test. One of the common IQ tests that is used today is called the Stanford-Binet IQ test. It was originally designed in 1904 by a man named Alfred Binet from France, and then later it was revised at Stanford University by Louis Terman in 1916. The Stanford-Binet IQ test is one of two IQ tests that we consider to be reliable and valid today. The second IQ test that is popularly used today is called the Wechsler IQ test, first developed by David Wechsler in the 1940s. Before David Wechsler, an IQ test gave one number. And so if you ask somebody, what's your IQ? You got one answer, one number. Oh, my IQ is 120. But David Wechsler had an interesting idea that sometimes people are good at verbal information. Verbal means using words. And other times they're good at nonverbal, like solving puzzles. And so Wechsler came up with the idea of having a verbal IQ and a performance IQ. So if you ask someone, what's your IQ? Well, which one? My verbal, my performance, or my total IQ? So here are some kind of problems you might find on an IQ test, including verbal problems. A child might be shown a picture and asked, what is missing from this picture? Or we might ask you for information on what continent is France, or comprehension, why are children required to go to school, or arithmetic, how many hours will it take to drive 150 miles at 50 miles per hour, or similarities, how are a calculator and a typewriter alike, or digit span, repeat the following numbers backward, 2, 4, 3, 5, 8, 9, 6. Ooh, that's a hard one. Or vocabulary, what does audacity mean? Okay, those are all verbal problems because they're using words. But on the right, we have an example of a performance problem. We don't need any words to solve this problem. We have to replicate the image that is shown using some blocks. Here's a child doing a performance IQ problem. This is called the block design test. IQ tests are not paper and pencil tests that you might take in high school, and they're not online tests that you take, although people call them IQ tests. They're not. That's not really correct. An IQ test is given by one person to one person. So the test examiner gives the IQ test to an individual, one person. Here's a child who's taking a performance problem with the what we call psychometrist, the person doing the IQ measurement. Would you like to try a performance item similar to what you might find on an IQ test? Which of the 5 choices belongs in the square with a question mark? Have you got it? It's number 4. Would you like to try a couple more performance problems? On the top, the answer is number 3. And on the bottom, did you get it? It's number 2. Yay, you got it right. In the past, it was common to just have one number, one IQ score when you took an IQ test. And then David Wexler came up with this idea of a verbal IQ and a performance IQ. So he had really 3 IQ scores, a verbal, a performance, and then what was called a full scale IQ. That was just an average of the 2 others. Today, it's more common to have multiple IQs. So an IQ test is really measuring many different factors, many different domains. Here, for example, are some of the domains found on the Stanford-Binet test. The Wexler IQ test today also has this idea of many different IQs. So when you take a Wexler test, you get a verbal comprehension score, perceptual reasoning score, a working memory score, and a processing speed score. And each of these are determined by many different subtests as shown here in this illustration. An IQ score is a number that has an average of 100 comparing a person taking a test to others in their same age range. So if a 5-year-old takes a test, you compare them to other 5-year-olds and how well they can answer and solve problems on that test. If an adult takes a test, you compare them to other adults. So you're always being compared to your age group. If you get a score of 100, that means that you are average for your age group. You were able to solve the average number of problems in each category for your age group. And one standard deviation on an IQ test is 15 points. So if you have a score of 115, it means you're an average amount above average. A score of 130 would be very high, and a score of 145 is ridiculously high. A score of 85 is an average amount below average, and a score of 70 is quite low, and a score of 55 is very low compared to other people in your age group. This illustration shows you the percentage of scores that fall within each of the standard deviation areas. So from the average 100 up to 115, 34% of the scores are in there. And similarly, from 100 down to 85, 34% in there. So you can see that there are many, many people that pile up in the middle. So scores between 85 and 115 are very, very common. And then as you go out into the extremes, for example, over 145 or under 55, that's very, very small percentage of the population. Now, one of the things that we know about in psychology is called test bias. And that is what happens when you use a test on a group that was not included in the creation of the test. So when we create a test, we have a standardized group and usually a representative selection of people from within a culture. And then you are compared to people in your age group. But if a test contains items that are unfair to the group, then that's called test bias. Here's a cartoon where the psychologist says, for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. I don't think the fish is going to do well on that test. Here's another cartoon that reminds us about test bias. Professor Sapinski proved that the squid is more intelligent than the house cat when posed with puzzles under similar conditions. Yes, under these conditions, of course, the squid, hey, that looks like an octopus, by the way, is more successful than the cat. Of course, on an IQ test, people get sometimes high scores, sometimes low scores. Some people have, well, a lot of people have average scores. So the question psychologists have is what causes these differences And there are many, many things, of course, including genetics or heredity, the chemical recipes that we inherit from our parents, of course, the culture that we grow up in and our family and our experiences, what kind of school do you go to, what kind of learning do you get, your nutrition, any kind of toxins, disease, and of course, there are substances in our environment that, like lead, for example, that can lower a child's IQ. So there are many different things that influence IQ, all the way from genetics to our experiences to our environment. Psychologists have lots of different ideas about intelligence, different kinds of intelligence, different ways to measure it. The IQ test is just one way to do it, although it is the most common and maybe the most reliable, the most valid, the most accurate. An IQ test we can think of as analytic or academic. An IQ test is measuring a person's ability to solve problems that use words and numbers and symbols and logic and sequences and puzzles and memory and so on. It's kind of like school intelligence. One of the big ideas about intelligence is the question, is intelligence just one characteristic, one factor, or is intelligence made up of many, many different abilities? So the idea that there's just one factor is called G. That's lowercase g. That stands for general intelligence. And this is the idea of, well, kind of like height. If you ask somebody, what's your height? There's just one answer. Height is just a concept that refers to one factor. So some psychologists believe that there's evidence that intelligence is just one general factor. Other psychologists argue that intelligence is made up of many different special traits. We use the lowercase s to mean specific abilities that might all pool together to make intelligence. By the way, today, most psychologists feel that there's some combination of the two. One of the techniques that we have in the sciences is called factor analysis. A factor means a characteristic or a trait that stands on its own. It's independent. It is not dependent on other factors. So we're looking for these factors. With intelligence, what we do is we give people a whole bunch of tests that measure different kinds of cognitive, mental, intellectual abilities. And then we take the scores and we put them into a computer and we program the computer to analyze by looking at correlations. When we do this, we come up with 7 primary mental abilities: verbal ability, word fluency, meaning being able to think of the right word at the right time, number, meaning like arithmetic, memory, perception, reasoning, like logic, and then spatial ability. So these are considered 7 primary mental abilities based on factor analysis. Here's a third important idea about intelligence, the idea of crystallized intelligence versus fluid intelligence. Crystallized intelligence, kind of like building up crystals in your head, means that you've accumulated knowledge. This is what most people would call book smarts, that you just know a lot of stuff. Then, on the other hand, there's what's called fluid intelligence. This means a person's ability to think really quickly and to think agilely and to think well, to figure out stuff. So that's different than accumulated knowledge. So there's accumulated knowledge we call crystallized intelligence, and then there's ability to think and figure things out. That's called fluid intelligence. So when we say someone is smart, we can mean, well, at least 2 things, maybe a lot of different things. But one thing we might mean when we say someone is smart, the guy on the left who has a lot of knowledge that he's accumulated over many, many years, he has crystallized intelligence. But we also might mean when we say someone is smart, like the little boy on the right, he has what we call fluid intelligence. He's able to pick up things quickly, figure out things easily. When psychologists measure these 2 kinds of intelligence over the lifespan, they find that fluid intelligence is high in young people and then tends to go down with age, whereas crystallized intelligence, accumulated knowledge, is low in young people and tends to go up with age. So IQ tests measure both of these, which means general IQ test scores tend to be about the same throughout lifespan. Here's a study from 2014 that measured many different intellectual abilities, and you can see the result is fluid intelligence went down over age and crystallized intelligence went up, just as we expect. But also notice that other areas of intellect went up, like humanities and civics. Here's another research study from 2015 that found that in middle age, vocabulary, comprehension, and information reach their peak. Here's another idea about intelligence that you've probably heard of. The idea is called emotional intelligence. And the idea is that people will be successful if they're good at recognizing emotions in themselves and in others and in knowing what to do about it. When you're angry, when someone else is angry, when you're sad, when someone else is sad, you know what to do about it. And it has been discovered that the key to emotional intelligence is having empathy, the ability to put yourself in somebody else's place. Someone says to you, I'm sad, and you say, oh, don't be sad. Or they say, I'm angry. Oh, stop being angry. That's not empathy. When we have empathy, we can put ourselves in the other person's place and say something like, thanks for confiding in me and trusting in me. I'm here for you. Or, oh, that is just awful. That's terrible what you're going through. I'm on your side. Or, you must feel so hopeless in this situation. I can feel your pain. That shows empathy. Here's a list of many of the different qualities that make up emotional intelligence. And you can have a score called your EQ. And the concept is that people with a high EQ will be more successful in their relationships, in their parenting, in their friendships, in their careers, and they're dealing with problems and so on. That EQ is better than IQ for a lot of situations. Here's another idea about intelligence that comes from a psychologist named Robert Sternberg. When he was a child, he was told that he wasn't smart enough to succeed. Well, that's just not a good thing to tell children, is it? And it turns out it was completely wrong for him, that he had a very, very high IQ and he succeeded very, very much in life, became a very famous psychologist and developed a theory about intelligence called Triarchic theory. It means three big arches. And Sternberg says we need to stop thinking of intelligence as just analytical. There's two other big components of intelligence. One is practical. That means taking your knowledge and being able to apply it in the real world. And then third is creativity, to have creative intelligence, to be able to think of new, fresh, innovative ideas that will work. Sternberg, who gave us triarchic theory, also said culture is very important when it comes to intelligence. What this means, according to Robert Sternberg, is that what is intelligent in one culture might not be intelligent in another culture. That is, the skills that we need to succeed in a particular culture can vary from one place to another. For example, on the left, suppose we have an accountant in the United States who has to have certain skills with using numbers and keyboards and so on. And then on the right, we have the Sherpa in Tibet who takes people up the mountains, and he has to have completely different skills to be intelligent. He has to know how to make a peace sign and have good relationships with people, and he has to know what to do if there's an avalanche and so on. So intelligence kind of depends upon the situation you're in or the culture that you're in. Now, on the other hand, some psychologists have tried to make a test that would be culture fair or culture free. That is, a test of intelligence that would work on any culture in the world. Didn't matter what your culture was. This would somehow measure intelligence in everybody. So here's an example of an item from a culture fair test. So notice that you don't need any language for this test. You simply look at it and you see, oh, there's a missing space of a triangle, and then there's 6 triangles to choose from. Which one would fit? I like number 5, it's pretty, but the right answer, of course, is number 3. Here's another item from a culture fair IQ test. By the way, is it really fair to every culture to use geometric shapes? Probably not. But look at this problem, and you'll see what's missing is a triangle with a black dot on the inside. So the answer is B. Here's a similar problem that's a little bit harder. Look at the top row. You have a triangle, then a vertical line, and then a triangle that's been stretched vertically. The second row, you have a circle, a horizontal line, and a circle that's been stretched horizontally. The third row, we have a square, and then both a vertical line and a horizontal line. That means we have to stretch the square both directions. So the right answer is, yep, you got it, C. One more item from a culture fair IQ test, if such a thing could exist. What's missing here? Well, if we look at the rows, it looks like we're missing 2 triangles that are white. So it looks like number 5 is the right answer here. Did you get it? Let's do one more idea about intelligence. This one comes from Howard Gardner of Harvard University, who came up with this concept of multiple intelligences. That's the term he uses. That was the name of his book. And he says, let's broaden the definition of intelligence to include all kinds of different abilities. So he has 9 of them: linguistic, meaning languages; spatial, like an artist would do; musical; body or kinetic or kinesthetic, that means ability to move your body around like a dancer; logical, mathematical; intrapersonal, intra means within yourself; interpersonal, that means with other people, relating to other people; naturalistic, going out in nature and knowing how to deal with nature; and existential, that means like thinking about philosophical ideas about the existence of life, the meaning of life. By the way, not all psychologists like this idea of multiple intelligences, and they don't think that it's a really an accurate way of thinking about how the brain works. But when we do accept the idea of multiple intelligences, we can then measure people's different abilities and suggest different occupations for them. So here, for example, in this illustration, we see different occupations associated with Howard Gardner's ideas about multiple intelligences. Okay, I hope this video got you thinking about intelligence. It gave you some kind of interesting ideas. And watch some more of my videos on my channel, Brucey. Thanks, and bye-bye.